Today we will tell you a story from more than 2,500 years ago, a story about an old man who went to Master Confucius in search of answers to a dilemma that many face in old age. His name was Li Wei, and he dedicated his entire life to his children, believing that when he reached old age, a special place would be prepared for him by their side. When he moved in with his family, he thought he would finally find peace and friendly companionship. But over time, he realized that the closer he was to his family, the lonelier he felt. His children were constantly busy, his grandchildren were distracted, and the conversations that used to flow naturally became short and rushed. The house was full, but his heart had never been so empty. Not understanding why his presence seemed to burden rather than be welcomed, Li Wei decided to seek help. He had heard of Confucius, the master of wisdom, and with hope in his heart, he set out for the temple where the sage taught. Arriving there, he found Confucius sitting under the shade of a cherry tree, surrounded by attentive students. The old man approached, respectfully bowed, and said, "Teacher, I have cared for my children my whole life. Now that I am old, I thought that by living near them, I would find love and belonging, but instead, I feel invisible." Confucius observed for a moment and calmly replied, "When you see a wise person, think about equaling them in virtue. When you see a person without virtue, examine yourself." From that moment, the master's words forever changed Li Wei's perspective on his life, and they can change yours too. Confucius paused for a moment, observing the old man standing before him. Li Wei looked tired, but it wasn't just the weight of age that bowed his shoulders. There was something deeper, a quiet pain, a sense that he had done everything right but still felt lost. The master raised his eyes to the sky and then addressed the old man. "Li, why do you think that being close to your children guarantees you a place in their hearts?" The old man frowned, surprised by the question. "Master, I worked my whole life to give my children a better future. I gave up my own desires so they could grow up safely. Now that I am old, all I want is to be near, to share moments, to feel part of the family I created. But instead, I realize that my presence has become a detail, something secondary. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Isn't it the duty of children to care for their parents in old age?" Confucius listened attentively, his expression remaining serene. Then he pointed to a vase of water standing nearby and said, "Fill this vase to the brim, and what will happen?" Li Wei hesitated for a moment before answering. "The water will spill over the edge." The master nodded. So it is with human relationships. When we try to place ourselves beyond the space that belongs to us, an imbalance arises. You built a home for your children, and now you want to be its center, even when they already have their own lives. Li bowed his head. "So, teacher, what should I have done?" Confucius looked at the trees in the garden and replied, "Nature teaches us a simple truth. A river never returns to its source, but follows its course to the ocean. So it is with children. You raised them to follow their own path. Now they must follow it." The old man felt a tightness in his chest. For years, he believed that old age was a return to the family, a time of giving back and hospitality. But now he began to understand that expectations could be a mistake. Confucius continued, "Love and respect cannot be demanded. They can only be cultivated. The more you try to take center stage in your children's lives, the more they feel your presence as a burden. True love is born from freedom, not obligation." The old man was silent. It dawned on him that he had forgotten something essential. He needed to live for himself too. Finally, he raised his eyes to Confucius and asked, "What should I do now, teacher? How do I find my path?" The sage smiled gently and replied, "The journey is not over yet. Li, now you must learn what it means to age wisely. One who inspires respect will be respected. One who cultivates kindness will find it in return. Your purpose does not end with your children." He needed to find his own purpose, and it was there, under the guidance of the great teacher, that his true path began. Serenity reigned in the temple garden. The wind gently swayed the leaves. Li was silent, reflecting on Confucius's words. The master observed him, understanding the old man's inner struggle. After a moment, he pointed to two trees growing close to each other in the courtyard, their branches chaotically intertwined, vying for space under the sunlight. "Tell me, Li," said Confucius, "what happens when two trees grow too close to each other?" Li looked at the trees and paused for a moment before answering. "Their branches intertwine. They compete for space, for light." Confucius nodded. "Does this make them stronger or more fragile?" Li sighed. "More fragile, master. They cannot grow freely. Their branches twist, struggling for a place under the sun." Confucius smiled faintly. "Such is life." Li BWWW. "We often think that closeness means unity, but in reality, it can create tension. Respect and love cannot be imposed. They can only be cultivated. When we try to insert ourselves into someone else's routine, we may end up suffocating rather than strengthening bonds." The old man was silent. He recalled his arrival at his eldest son's house. At first, everything seemed perfect: family dinners, lively conversations, the sweet illusion that he had finally become part of a new stage in his children's lives. But over time, he realized that his presence was no longer a special event, just a detail that went unnoticed. He noticed impatient glances when he asked too many questions, smiles that felt obligatory, awkward silences when he spoke of his feelings. His children's daily routine was different from his own. They were always busy, immersed in their own affairs, while he had plenty of time. What was a need for connection for him was an additional responsibility for them. "But, master," Li raised his voice in frustration, "I did this for them." Confucius looked at him with compassion. "Li, what happens if you take a handful of sand and squeeze it tightly?" The old man frowned. "It slips through your fingers." "Exactly," said the master. "The same happens with human bonds. Love and respect do not flourish under pressure. The more you demand closeness, the further people drift away." Li bowed his head. He didn't want to be a burden, but all he wanted was to feel part of the life he loved. Confucius understood his sadness and placed a hand on his shoulder. "The problem, Li, is not that your children don't love you. The problem is that you expect their love to manifest the way you want. But every person expresses their affection in their own way." Li raised his head. "So what should I do?" Confucius smiled and pointed to the river flowing nearby. "Look at the water. It simply flows. If you want your children to respect you, stop trying to hold them back. Let them miss you, and you will see that respect and affection will come on their own." At that moment, Li began to understand that true love lies not in constant physical presence, but in knowing when to give space. With this lesson, his perspective on old age began to change. Silence enveloped Li. In his mind, Confucius's words still echoed. Physical closeness does not mean closeness of the heart. He knew it was true, but accepting it was another matter. After some reflection, Li took a deep breath and asked, "Master, I cared for my children my whole life, made sacrifices so they could have a better future. Now that I'm old, isn't it fair to expect them to do the same for me?" Confucius replied, "The superior person blames themselves. The common person blames others. Li, when you plant a tree, do you expect it to give you shade in your old age?" The old man frowned. "No, master. I plant it because I know the tree must grow freely, follow its own path." Confucius nodded. "Exactly. So why did you expect your children to be different? You raised them to follow their own path, not to interrupt it to revolve around you. True love is not a debt to be repaid." Li bowed his head. He had never thought of it that way. For years, he believed his efforts and devotion would be rewarded in old age. But now he realized that those expectations might have been too heavy a burden for his children. "But, master," he murmured, "how can I accept this? How can I stop expecting?" Confucius smiled faintly and pointed to a bird sitting on a nearby branch. "Look at this bird. When it was young, its mother fed it. But one day she pushed it out of the nest and it flew away. Now it builds its own nest, feeds its own chicks. If the mother tried to trap it, hoping it would never leave the nest, it would be a mistake. The mistake of parents in old age is not loving their children too much, but expecting them to return that love in the way they want. If love must be collected, it turns into an obligation, not a genuine feeling." The old man fell silent for a long time. He recalled when his children were young and all he did for them. Now he realized that, without knowing it, he had hoped his old age would mirror his youth. But that was impossible. Time moves only forward. "So, teacher, what should I do now?" Confucius looked at the horizon and replied, "It is easier to light a candle than to curse the darkness," said the master. "Find joy in what is within your control. Live not as a burden to others, but as an example of wisdom and independence. Then respect will come." The pain of expectation still lingered, but now understanding joined it. He finally began to realize that his children were not responsible for his happiness. That journey was his alone. Confucius walked slowly through the temple garden, and Li silently followed, lost in his own thoughts. With each step, the old man felt the pain of expectation turning into an emptiness that was hard to accept. "Teacher," he murmured, "if I cannot rely on my children to care for me, then what is my place? If closeness does not strengthen bonds, what should I have done?" Confucius stopped before a small lake and looked at the clear water reflecting the sky. "Li, have you ever held water in your hands?" The old man frowned, not understanding. "Yes, master. If you're not careful, it slips through your fingers." Confucius nodded. "And the more you try to hold it, the faster it escapes. The same is true with love and respect. The more you try to hold them, the more they slip through your fingers." Li turned away, reflecting. He recalled his arrival at his children's home. At first, they welcomed him with joy, but over time, he noticed small signs of impatience. Conversations became rushed, shared moments less frequent. His children still respected him, but the spontaneity was gone. "Teacher, my children haven't stopped loving me, but why, even without words, do I feel my presence has become a burden?" Confucius smiled gently. "Because you taught them to fly, and now you cling to their wings to avoid falling." The old man felt a tightness in his chest. "But I just wanted to be part of their lives." The sage gently interrupted him. "And that's the problem. A child's love for their parents is natural, but it cannot be demanded or sustained by guilt. Your presence reminds them that they cannot always be there for you, that they have their own families, their own duties. This creates an invisible burden that erodes bonds. Lee nodded, feeling vulnerable. He didn't want to be a burden, but without realizing it, he had placed an emotional weight on his children. He wanted closeness, but had created silent distance instead. "So, teacher, what should I do?" Confucius looked back at the lake and calmly replied, "The river never tries to hold back the water passing through it. It simply flows, letting the water come and go. If you want to be respected, stop trying to hold your children in your routine. Let them miss you, and you will see affection and regard come naturally." For the first time, Lee understood that true love is not about always being nearby, but knowing when to let go. He still didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he understood he needed to change. With this lesson, his path to finding a new purpose began to take shape. A gentle breeze blew through the temple garden, and Lee walked beside Confucius, still processing his teacher's words. He realized that expecting repayment from his children was a mistake, and that their constant presence could foster guilt instead of affection. But one question remained unanswered. If he shouldn't depend on his children, what should his path be? "Master," Lee broke the silence, "I dedicated my whole life to my family. My days revolved around their needs. If I don't care for my children, what am I good for?" Confucius stopped before a solitary tree in the garden and pointed to it. "Look at this tree, Lee. Once it was a small, fragile seed. To grow, it needed care. But one day, it took root and no longer needed anyone's support. The tree still provides shade and shelter. It remains useful to those who pass by." Lee felt a tightness in his chest. His whole life, he thought his identity was tied to caring for his children. But now he realized he could exist without being at the center of their lives. "The problem, Lee, is not that you've run out of purpose. The problem is that you never learned to live for yourself. You always lived for others. And now you must ask yourself, who are you besides a father?" This question echoed within him. He had never thought about it before. What made him happy? What brought him joy besides his family? "But Master, what can an old man do to find a new purpose when purpose seems so far away?" "Don't change the goal, change the steps," said the master. Confucius took a handful of seeds and handed them to the old man. "You can plant, you can teach, you can learn. Old age is not a time for waiting, but a time for discovery. As long as there is life, there is something to explore." Lee closed his hand around the seeds and felt something different for the first time. He realized he didn't need to depend on his children to feel the value of his life. From that moment, he decided to find a new purpose that wasn't tied to past expectations, but to what he could still build. Thus began his path to true independence. Lee held the seeds Confucius gave him, feeling the symbolic weight of the gesture. His children had gone their own ways, but he was still here. His life wasn't over. Following his teacher's guidance, he gradually began to understand that the sadness he felt wasn't just from being apart from his children, but from not knowing who he was without them. One morning, while walking through the temple, he came across a young student struggling to tend a small garden. The boy was upset because his seedlings weren't growing as he had hoped. "You're making a mistake with watering," said Lee, observing the soggy soil. "If you water too much, the roots won't have room to grow and strengthen. The young man looked at him curiously. "How do you know this?" Li smiled faintly. "I spent my youth working in the fields. I learned that too much care can suffocate just as much as too little." The student nodded, absorbing the old man's words, and then asked for more advice. For years, Li thought his role in life was tied solely to his family. Now he realized he still had something to offer the world, even beyond the role of a father. He began helping the young man with the garden, and soon other students started coming to him for advice. Within a few weeks, they were calling him Master Li in honor of his experience. That's when he realized something important. The less he sought to impose his presence, the more he was valued. Before, when he lived for his children, he tried to force his presence on them. Now he simply existed, and those who needed his wisdom came to him on their own. His days at the temple became different. Li woke up with purpose. He taught his students about the soil, the timing of harvests, patience, and balance. He learned new things himself, things he couldn't have learned from anyone else. Then something unexpected happened. One day, as he tended to his plants, a young monk approached and handed him a letter. It was from his eldest son. "Father, I haven't seen you in a long time. I miss you. The grandchildren ask about you. We'd love for you to visit us." Li closed his eyes and smiled. When he stopped expecting love from his children, it came on its own. For the first time, he felt truly free, not because he distanced himself from his family, but because he learned to live for himself. And in that moment, he understood what Confucius had been trying to teach him all along. Respect and love come when they are not demanded but gently cultivated. His son's invitation to visit sparked new feelings in Li. Before, he would have rushed to the family home full of hopes and expectations. But now, after weeks spent in the Confucian temple, he no longer felt anxious about being accepted or proving his worth to his children. He was content with his own life. His days had found meaning. He taught his students about the soil, planted his own seedlings, and spent evenings reflecting on what he had learned over the years. Now he saw this visit not as a necessity, but as a meeting without obligations, something that would happen naturally. Calmly gathering his few belongings, he set out for the family home. This time, he went not as someone needing attention, but as someone who knew who he was, regardless of his children's love. When he arrived, he noticed some differences. His son greeted him with a sincere, unhurried smile. The grandchildren, who once seemed distracted, ran to him, eager to talk. "Father, we were worried. You left so suddenly." "But you look well," said his eldest son, observing him. Li smiled. "Yes, I found my own path. I realized that old age doesn't have to be a time of waiting and dependence. It can be a time of discovery, learning, and ease." His son nodded, seeming to understand for the first time something he hadn't realized before. His father was here, not out of necessity, but because he was wanted. Li noticed something had changed. Before, it felt like his children accepted him out of duty. Now he was there because they wanted to see him, because his presence was valued. They didn't demand anything from him. In the morning, as he prepared to leave, his son asked, "When will you come back to us?" Li smiled and replied, "When the time comes." And so he returned to the temple, without haste, without sadness. He no longer needed to be constantly present to be remembered with love. He was no longer a burden, but a presence that was missed. And finally, he understood Confucius's most important teaching. The strongest bonds are not those tied by obligations, but those that exist through freedom. Li Wei's story teaches us a truth that many come to realize slowly. Love and respect cannot be demanded. They can only be cultivated. Parents, well into old age, believe that physical closeness to their children guarantees them affection and attention. However, as Confucius taught Li, the more we try to hold on to others, the more we become a burden rather than a desired presence. A profound transformation happened to Li. He realized that his happiness should not depend on his children but on his own path. When he stopped seeking forced recognition and acceptance, he gained something even more valuable: the freedom to live for himself. And in the end, something curious happened. When he stopped demanding his children's presence, they valued him more. Respect and love returned on their own, without the guilt and obligations that once weighed them down. Confucius's greatest teaching is this: the strongest bonds survive through freedom. If we can learn anything from Li's story, it is that old age should not be a time of waiting and regret, but a time of rebirth and rediscovery of oneself. The question remains open: are you living for yourself, or are you simply waiting for others to fill the void you could fill? Please, write your thoughts below. I'm moving on, and thank you. If this reflection was helpful to you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to receive more stories and reflections like this. That way, you won't miss any new material. Take care of yourself, and see you next time.